All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eric Langenbacher. I am a senior fellow and the director of the Society Culture and Politics program at the American German Institute here in Washington, D.C. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, which is entitled Testing the Political Landscape, Germany's Super Election Year and the Youth Vote. And we're doing this webinar today because there are numerous regional elections coming up this year in Germany, which are getting a lot of press. And the first one is actually this Sunday in the southwestern German state of Baden-Württemberg. So we'll start to preview what's going to happen there and in a variety of other elections coming up later this year. And to do so, we're very, very pleased to have Professor Dr. Thorsten Faas, who's currently a visiting professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And he holds the Hannah Arendt Visiting Chair for German and European Studies, which is generously funded by the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. His research focuses on electoral politics and campaign communications, particularly as they relate to young people and German elections. He's a principal investigator of the German longitudinal election study, which is a big deal, actually, and a member of the planning committee for Module 7 of the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems. So, Thorsten, the floor will be yours in a second. Thorsten will do a presentation, and then once he's finished, we will transition to a Q&A period. I would ask anybody who has a question for Thorsten to type it into the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and then I will collect them and read them off to Thorsten. All right, Thorsten, please.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, and welcome also from my side to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your interest in German elections there. Thanks for the interest in my perspective on these. I will try to present some things that I think are interesting in the context of this super election year that we once again have in Germany, and that might also characterize things as they will evolve over the course of the year. Eric has already mentioned some of the elections that we will have this year. So here's a little map of Germany, and we actually will start off at the very southwest on this Sunday, as Eric has already said. In the state of Baden-Württemberg, traditionally, they used to have elections on exactly the same date as they would in the state of Rhineland-Pfalz, which is slightly more to the north. But actually this year, for interesting, maybe strategic reasons, they decided to go early, or from the perspective of the people in Rhineland-Palatinate, they will have their chance to vote 2 weeks after that. So we'll have some in-between time there between the state election in Baden-Württemberg and the state election in Rhineland-Palatinate. But those will mark the start to the super election year before we head more towards the east and actually also more to the north. But I guess that's rather a random thing there, not really something that's done on purpose. But internationally, I would actually propose or project that this state election in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, a rather small state, especially with respect to population, but still that this state election in the state of Saxony-Anhalt that we will have on September 6th, that might actually attract the most attention from an international but also from a national perspective, because the AfD is actually in a very, very strong position there, very likely to come in first place, but actually more or even more significant, maybe even in a position to enter a government there for the very first time. And that would, of course, mark some, historic shift there in a way. And you can already think of headlines that might appear if that actually will take place. But that's not the end of the super election year. We'll have 2 more. They will actually take place on the same time, on the same date. Berlin, September 20, as well as Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the very northern state there. Both of these states will have their state elections on September 20. So 5 of the 16 German states will have elections. The people there will be called to the polls. And what's interesting, if we start off our discussion or my presentation from that point of view, these states are actually very, very different in political terms. If you look at the current polls, there's a lot of dynamic there actually, so we don't really know how things will evolve. But what we typically see, and I will come back to that in a minute, what we typically see is, especially on the state level, that polls do start to change as the election date comes closer. This is actually the case for Baden-Württemberg. I mean, this is media coverage of polls, so these kind of metaphors of a poll quake, an earthquake, ein Erdbeben in German is quite typical in terms of journalistic framing of these polls. But actually, from a substantial point of view, it's something that we've seen a number of times, that as state elections come closer, as the day of the election comes closer, the polls start to shift, start to move, and usually they will start to move in the direction of the current incumbent party. Again, I will come back to that in a minute. We see that for the state of Baden-Württemberg, but we also see it actually for the state of Rhineland-Palatinate, where we have a social democratic government that was trailing behind quite far in terms of polls, but has now actually recovered or actually closed the gap to the Christian Democrats significantly. And it's actually now a very tight race there that we do see. I already said these 5 state elections, or these 5 states, are very different, and they have historical or political traditions that are actually very different. Again, these are the 5 state elections, and what I've put down on this slide is just the governing party, not so much the coalition. I'll come back to that in a second. But actually the governing party, the party that has the prime minister in these states. And what you see when you look at that is that at the level of state politics, and if we focus on the position of the prime minister, or the party of the prime minister, I should say, to be precise, there's a lot of stability there over a very, very long period of time for most of these states. Most remarkable, for sure, the state of Rhineland-Palatinate, by chance my home state, but that's not really of importance there. But I'm saying this because when I grew up in my early days, Rhineland-Palatinate was a Christian democratic state. That was one of the traditional strongholds for the Christian Democrats. And it still is, actually, if you look at federal elections, if you look at European elections, even if you look at local elections, it is usually the Christian Democrats that come in first place there. But on the state level, the state of Rhineland-Palatinate has actually become one of the strongholds for the Social Democrats. They've been in power there ever since 1991, which is now 35 years. So that's actually really remarkable to see in a rather conservative rural state, to see a Social Democratic party in power there for such a long time. It's also true in a way if we move north to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, another state where the Social Democrats have been in power ever since 1998. The Christian Democrats have been in power in Saxony-Anhalt. They've held on to the position of the prime minister there ever since 2002. And even the Green prime minister, Winfried Kretschmann, probably heard of him. He's been the first ever Green prime minister in the state of Baden-Württemberg. But even he has now was able to hold on to this position for 15 years. So there's a lot of continuity actually on the level of state elections, on the level of who governs a country. Of course, there's always an exception, and that on this slide is the state of Berlin. And you might recall that something similar happened in the small state, the state of the Saarland, the Saar region in the very southwest. Those were in recent times one of the very few state elections where there was actually a change in power. The Berlin election in 2023, the one that had to be repeated. I'm sure you've heard of that, but that was a very special, a very peculiar election. And actually the Social Democrats were kind of thrown out of government there. At least, no, that's not true. They were thrown out of the state chancellery, so to speak. And a Christian Democratic prime minister took over. But that's clearly the exception. And I'm stressing this so much because for the rest of my talk, I will actually stress that there's a lot of volatility these days on the federal, on the national level, but also on the level of state politics, which is an interesting, almost contradiction to seeing that on that personal prime ministerial level, you have so much continuity, you could say. And that's an interesting take there. It's not really a contradiction, but that's something I think that's really characteristic for state politics these days. If we slightly extend that and actually look at the people that are running these 5 states, that's very interesting yet again when you think of these 5 state elections, because even though there's that continuity on a party level with respect to the question which party runs the country, there has been a lot of change on the actual personal level. Actually, there are only few incumbents actually running, and actually even fewer of these incumbents have been the incumbent in the previous election that took place for most of these states 4 years ago. Kretschmann, of course, is one of them in Baden-Württemberg. He's been the Green candidate ever since 2011, but he's actually not running for re-election. So he's the incumbent, but it's Cem Özdemir who's trying to become his successor. They weren't in a position to kind of make that transition in the course of the parliamentary term. So Kretschmann is the incumbent, and Özdemir, the Green main candidate, is trying to become his successor, but he has to win the election. That's different for the state of Rhineland-Palatinate. You see Alexander Schweitzer there. He's the prime minister in the state of Rhineland-Palatinate for 2-3 years now. So they actually made the transition from the very popular Malu Dreyer, who was the prime minister in Rhineland-Palatinate, to him. And that's usually what you want to do, because you want to make sure you really have the incumbency advantage in those state elections. They did that. The same happened in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. If you've never seen that person, it's Sven Schulze. He is the prime minister of the state of Saxony-Anhalt, but only has become the prime minister very recently, succeeding the very popular Rainer Haselhoff, who used to be the prime minister for quite a while. Manuela Schwesig been the prime minister for quite a while, and Kai Wegner, the mayor of Berlin, of course, he cannot have, or there's no way for him to have a long tradition because he just won the election 3 years ago. But on a personal level, a lot of these parties actually managed to hand over the position of the prime minister from one person to the next, and that's usually what you want to do, because there is a huge incumbency advantage at that level, and that actually is the explanation why we see so much continuity there with respect to the leading figures. It's not true for coalitions. If we extend the picture slightly more there, we've seen a lot of changes actually with respect to coalitions, but we also see, if you look at the map from that perspective, we see a huge variety of coalitions. They're actually in these 5 states, they each and everyone has a different coalition format currently. They've had even more or yet different ones yet again in the older times. So that's actually the characteristic thing. If you look at state government, state elections in Germany, continuity at the level of prime minister, the party there, more flexibility when it comes to the coalition or to the coalitions that run these countries, and even more volatility when it comes to vote shares for individual parties. And I'd like to show you a little graph there that actually shows how much has been going on at the level of state elections in recent times. We have a 2-chamber system, of course, in the German political system. There's the parliament, the Bundestag, but then there's also the second chamber, the second legislative chamber on the federal, on the national level, which is called the Bundesrat, which is made up of representatives from the state governments. So the state governments are crucial when it comes to the composition of that second chamber. What you see here is the composition of that second chamber, the Bundesrat, in 1997. So this is almost 30 years ago. And I'm just going to start this little animated graph to show you how much is actually going on at the level of state politics these days. So we start out as basically a red-green Bundesrat, but then slightly by way of state election, this changes into more a black-yellow coalition or a dominance. We're in the early 2010 years here, but things become really messy, you could say, in the last 5 to 10 years, actually. And if we wait for a second for this animation comes to its end, this is actually the situation we have now on the level of the Bundesrat. And you see, if you compare the starting point in the late 1990s to the position or to the situation today in 2024-25, we have three-party coalitions now at the level of states. We even have minority governments in some of these states. We have completely new parties that have already entered the stage, or even governments at the level of states. So German state politics has really become very colorful, you could say, to put it in positive terms, or very unpredictable, to put it in more ambivalent terms, maybe. And this is something that we can actually expect also for the year 2026. And again, it's an interesting contradiction, or tension there, at least, to see the continuity on the personal level, but then at the same time see this immense flexibility on the level of coalition governments there. Now, why does this happen, or what are the consequences of that for actual campaigns, for state election campaigns, and for what we see in terms of polls? I mean, I mentioned media coverage before. They're always fascinated by changes in polls, and that for good reasons, probably. But it's almost, you could say, a very predictable pattern. What you see here is the development of poll numbers 5 years ago in the state of Baden-Württemberg, and you see that the prime ministerial party, the Greens, they did pretty well in the polls, but at the expense of the Christian Democrats. That's the blue line here. They actually entered the campaign 6 months before the election date quite strongly, but they weren't really in a position to stick to those high numbers. They actually lost in the course of the campaign, and the Social Democrats weren't really able to pick up some momentum. So there is this tendency that actually the incumbent, either in absolute terms or at least in relative terms to the main challenger, that his or her position is actually strengthened in the course of the campaign. If we look at the poll numbers so far, I mean, the election is just this Sunday, so we don't know what the ultimate outcome will be. And there will be the final poll tonight, actually in, I guess, 2 hours time from now, or 3 published by the second German television. So we'll see whether that's in line with most recent polls. But we have yet again seen that there's a lot of poll dynamic there. The Greens in October 25, so that's 5 months ago, basically 4 or 5 months ago, they were below 20%. Now they're almost on par with the Christian Democrats, because they and their candidate, their leading candidate, they have really picked up this momentum there, and really gained support among Christian among the voters in the state of Baden-Württemberg. The same happens when you look at the state of Rhineland-Palatinate. It's even more pronounced there, the picture. Rhineland-Palatinate, the state that's governed by the Social Democrats ever since the early 90s. And you see that they were trailing behind in 2021 by 5, at times even 10 percentage points compared to the Christian Democrats. But when the people, the voters, really started to focus on state elections, whom do we want to govern the country, the state? That really happens in the very last weeks in the run-up to the campaign, in the run-up to election date. And so in 2021, but actually also in 2016, they basically turned that around in the very last campaign period. And it looks like there are fewer polls so far. That election is only on March 22nd, but it looks like they might be actually able to do that yet again. So they have closed the gap already. And if they're able to really match the Christian Democratic numbers, or even come in first place in a poll, that might even further strengthen that momentum that we clearly see there. For the state of Saxony-Anhalt, and I'll stop there then with that perspective on those 5 states. But for the state of Saxony-Anhalt, that last-minute swing was even more pronounced in 2021. You see that jump there on the very last yards, almost to the election day. It was a big surprise that the Christian Democrats came in that strong in 2021 at the expense of basically all other parties of the center, the Greens, the Liberals, the Social Democrats. So you really see in these East German states, you might have followed the election in Brandenburg, where we've seen that as well. On those last yards, it's almost this: is it AFD or is it another candidate that dominates the perspective, that dominates the race, and that creates a lot of momentum. However, we don't know whether that will turn out this way in 2026 in Saxony-Anhalt again. The AFD is clearly in first position there in current polls. And moreover, the Christian Democrats, who are the governing party at this time, they don't have this popular candidate, Rainer Haselhoff, that they have in 2020, that they had in 2021, but they have this complete newcomer that a lot of people don't know, and whether he will be able to initiate such a last-minute swing, that's really an open question. So the outset is even worse than 5 years ago, and the conditions that might lead to such momentum, as was the case in 21, they're not given to the same extent in this year's election. So that's why there's so much tension and so much anxiety actually with respect to that 2026 election in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. Few more words about this mechanism that I've just described, why we see that continuity on the prime ministerial level, and why we see those last-minute swings. These are the leading candidates in the upcoming state election in the state of Baden-Württemberg, and these are approval rates. You see there's a darker bar that signifies, or that is the approval for different candidates, whereas the lighter blue bars, that's actually disapproval for these different candidates. You see the current Prime Minister, Kretschmann from the Greens, very popular, approval of 59 in these polarized times that we have. That's quite remarkable. Disapproval at only 32%. So people are really happy with the way he was running the country. Özdemir, second row there, the Green leading candidate, used to be a minister at the federal level, so he's very well known either. And people also approve of his work, 49 approval, 40% disapproval. So there's kind of a net, a positive balance for him as well. What's most important, though, with respect to these numbers is that both of these candidates are well known. If you add the approval numbers and the disapproval numbers, you're at 91% for Kretschmann, you're at 89% for Özdemir, and the little gap in between the dark and the lighter blue bar, it's very small, but that's kind of the share of people that are not able to evaluate these candidates because they're not aware of them. They don't know them. They don't know them well enough to evaluate them. And that gap becomes huge for all the other candidates. And the third row here, that's Manuel Hagel. So he's the leading candidate for the Christian Democrats. Only 50%, only every other voter is in a position to actually evaluate his work. And that, of course, means if you have a rather unknown candidate who per balance also has a negative approval rate among those that do know him, that's not really something that allows you to run a good and successful campaign ultimately. Picture is even worse for the Social Democratic candidate, also for the AFD candidate, and also for the Liberal candidate. So simply to become known as a state politician is an incredible challenge these days, and actually a challenge that a lot of these candidates actually do not actually successfully master ultimately. If we briefly look at the state, unfortunately the picture looks slightly different, but it's exactly the same logic. It's approval rates, this time for politicians in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. And what we see here is that the former prime minister, one has to say, Rainer Haselhoff, he was known by everyone in the state. So in total, again, more than 90% were able to evaluate his work, and 59% actually did so in positive terms. For all the other candidates, even the current prime minister, Sven Schulze, second row here, more than 50% of the people do not see themselves in a position to evaluate that work. That's why I said that it's unclear whether Sven Schulze will really be in a position to create that momentum in August, September, to maybe bring his Christian Democratic Party back into first place. So in a way, these state elections have become referenda about the incumbents, and if they are well known and well evaluated, it's very, very hard to beat them. They usually come in first place with their party, and that's something that's quite likely to be seen in at least most of these state elections we have this year. Something to keep in mind for Sunday, for the reporting on the polls, the election polls on Sunday, we have to keep in mind that the 21 election took place under very peculiar circumstances, i.e. the corona pandemic. For Baden-Württemberg, these are the numbers for the state of Baden-Württemberg. We had a turnout of 64%. That's quite a normal, usual turnout for a state election in Germany, but the share of postal votes among those that voted was more than 50%. Situation is even more pronounced for the state of Rhineland-Palatinate. Election 2 weeks later, turnout again 64%, but the share of postal votes was at almost 2/3, at 67%. So 2 out of 3 votes were cast by mail, and I'm stressing this so much because for the exit polls that we will see in German times at 6 p.m. on those election days or election nights, they usually compare the numbers across the current and the previous election. But for the previous election, the actual exit poll, which is based on really people leaving their ballot station, their electoral district, that was just a very weird sample 5 years ago. So that might introduce some uncertainty there actually with respect to these 6 p.m. Publications of those exit polls. So we might have to wait a little longer actually when it comes to Sunday election before we really know how those ultimately fared. 2 more things, and then I'm really looking forward to your questions. If you're interested in issues in state elections or in any kind of election in Germany, I really recommend to have a look at this voting advice application that's become dominant almost as a tool in German election campaigns, the so-called Wahlomat, the election machine. What they do in that is they have 38 statements that they ask the parties to evaluate, and that you as a voter, as a user, can also evaluate whether you agree, disagree, or whether you have a neutral or ambivalent position to that. And based on that, you can, of course, find the party that's closest to you, but you can also use that instrument to look at kind of overlaps between different parties, to what extent any pair of 2 parties, to what extent their issue positions overlap, or to what extent they actually disagree with respect to certain issue positions. And together with my colleague Ansgar Wolsing, I have had a look at actually that election machine, the Wahlomat, in the state of Baden-Württemberg. Keep in mind, it's based on 38 hypotheses, 38 statements. And what you see here is just the number of congruent answers that different parties gave. And the larger the circle, the darker blue the circle, the more agreement there is between 2 parties. So we actually see, not surprisingly, quite a high agreement between Greens and the Social Democrats, also between Greens and the left. Actually, that is slightly interesting because the Greens in Baden-Württemberg are often said to be very conservative relative to to the Greens in other states, but they still have a very high agreement here with Die Linke, the left. What I would like to stress here is, and like to maybe have you a quick look at the AfD row here, because what you see is that the AfD does have a lot of issue agreement with Christian Democrats and the liberals. And that's exactly the tension that we're experiencing so massively these days, that on a lot of issue positions, day-to-day politics, there's a lot of agreement between AfD and Christian Democrats, AfD and also the liberals here, also AfD and the BSW, the new party founded by Sarah Wagenknecht. But of course, at the same time, don't get me wrong there, at the same time, there is the question of democracy, of treating minorities, where there are huge gaps between the Christian Democrats and the AfD. It's an open question that's intensely debated, whether it should be treated as an extremist party or not. So the tension there is that there is issue agreement for some things, but then there are these fundamental differences between Christian Democrats and the AfD. But still, that's why dealing with that party remains such a huge challenge these days in actually all of the states, but that's even more pronounced and true in East German states. Now, Eric promised, and I haven't said a word about young people, and I apologize to all the young people in the room, but Eric promised that I would say a few words about young people as well, and that's really promised the last thing I'm going to say before I'll try to answer your questions as good as I can. It's interesting to have a look at young people in these two state elections in the Southwest, because we have different voting ages for these two state elections. The voting age for the state election Baden-Württemberg is 16. The voting age for the state election in Rhineland-Palatinate is 18. So that's an interesting difference there. What's even more interesting is if you look at policies that have been adopted in the recent years, the government of Greens and Christian Democrats did lower the voting age to 16, even though that's not the official position of the Christian Democrats. And moreover, they also allowed that 16, 17-year-olds can run for local parliaments. That's been a premiere in German politics. So that's quite interesting to see that lowering of voting ages with respect to the right to vote, but also the right to be elected. The government in Rhineland-Palatinate would have loved to do the same, but they didn't find the necessary supermajorities to change the constitution in that way. So it's yet again a good example that we have really a patchwork with respect to voting ages in Germany these days, something that we should really be serious about, because what we've seen in a paper we've written is that if young people make this experience of being allowed to vote in one election, not being allowed in another election, that actually does create dissatisfaction with democracy. It creates feelings of lower external efficacy, even beyond the specific elections. So they really socialized with frustration when it comes to election. What's peculiar with respect to their substantial voting patterns, and I refer to, and I can send that around later on. I've written a little piece where I've just looked at which parties have young people in Germany voted for if you look at elections for the last 50 years. And all you have to take away from this mass of dots and squares and triangles and diamonds here is that in recent years, in most recent elections, young people have really voted all over the place. So that uncertainty, that volatility that we in general see with respect to state elections, I talked about that, we specifically see that for young people and their voting behavior. And that, of course, means, unless we assume that for some reason they become more organized with respect to their voting behavior as a group, that uncertainty, that high volatility, that higher fragmentation, that is actually the new normal for elections in Germany on all levels of elections. Does that mean I know how the election on Sunday ultimately what the result will be like? Definitely not. So I guess I've spent quite a lot of time to tell you why elections are so uncertain these days in Germany, and I'm sorry if you had expected that I'll tell you exactly how the elections will go out, because I don't think it would be serious and actually appropriate to do so, because we just don't know what can happen up until election day. So I guess we have to wait up until Sunday. Still, having said that, I do thank you for your attention and really to look forward to all of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torsten. That was extremely rich and very detailed, and has generated a lot of questions, at least in my mind. So again, I would like to encourage our participants to type their questions into the chat or the Q&A, but maybe I'll start with a couple of questions as well. So I know that it's a perpetual complaint from us academics that the politicians actually don't read our research and our findings as much as they should. But presumably, this whole issue of incumbency and the fact that incumbent parties, and especially their minister presidents or candidates, if they're well known, seem to surge towards the end of an election campaign. So I would hope that that is known. But I guess I have two questions about that. One specific question to Saxony-Anhalt, which is, if the old minister president Hasselhoff was so well known and liked, why did he step down? And I mean, the Sven Schulze has only been in office since the end of January of this year, kind of thing. So that would seem to be an own goal, given what we know about incumbency and stuff like that. And then my second question related to this dynamic is, I mean, one of the things that one constantly hears about the AFD is that they do so well because they're anti-establishment. They're the outsider party. They might be a protest vote and everything like that. So how do you explain that seeming paradox that on one hand, it seems that outsiders are doing well in German politics, yet on the other hand, there's this kind of incumbency advantage?
Yeah, thanks so much, Eric, for both of these questions. I mean, looking at these 5 state elections and how they dealt, the governing parties, how they dealt with transition of power is really interesting. I mean, the Green example is in a way even worse. They didn't even manage to hand over the power to their leading candidate. So now you have the popular Prime Minister Kretschmann, and you have that the candidate Özdemir. But the Christian Democrats, apparently they made very clear that they wouldn't elect him as the prime minister. And I mean, they are in a coalition together, right? So the Greens in a way had to stick with Kretschmann. Maybe he was quite happy about that too. I don't know. But I mean, these are things that a coalition has to agree upon to actually, elect a new prime minister. They usually need a new vote of approval that takes these absolute majority of members, and we've seen a number of cases that that's not a given. So if there's insecurity about having guaranteed enough votes for that, that might be an issue. Saxony-Anhalt is even more complicated in my perception. I haven't been in Germany for a while, so but when I was still there, I mean, it's a very difficult regional branch of the CDU. They are set to be very conservative, very open to possibly working together with the AfD. But Hasselhoff clearly had that ruled out, and I think that was a credible position from his personal position. So the question, would he step down? Would he yet run again as the leading candidate? Was also a question of an internal power struggle, and maybe eventually he just felt that he doesn't have I mean, it's these are extremely difficult positions, right? Given the political circumstances as they are. So maybe he felt that he's done enough, and ultimately he did give up. Consequence, then he stepped down. So in a way, that was he acknowledged that at least then he should go all the way and hand over the position, the office to Sven Schulze, although he really has a very long way to go. I mean, it's just, there will be a summer break, so it's just 5 more months to go, and he's not well known in the state of Saxony-Anhalt. So this is really going to be a crucial key election with a very open outcome. The AfD question, I mean, what we see almost on all levels, even with respect to the national level, that the candidates don't play that strong a role for voting for the AfD compared to other parties. So their candidates are not well known. I mean, we've seen that. Even I mean, it has changed for Alice Weidel as kind of their dominant figure these days, but even that took quite a while. If you look at federal elections, at constituency voting, we usually see a perfect overlap for the AfD between first votes and second votes. telling us that there's hardly any personal element in voting for the AfD. So that can be both in a way. It can be protest. I don't want any of the other parties, so I go all the way with the AfD. But there's also, and I think we tend to underestimate that, there's significant issue agreement with these extremist positions that the AfD has. It's too easy, and actually we have to be careful there. It's too easy to label the whole success of the AfD as just a protest vote. There's really significant agreement. And if you ask the voters, they actually say, "Oh, I vote for them because I support their ideas." But the outside perspective still is that their success is due to protest. But that's actually not quite true. But it's clearly issues, not necessarily a personal element there.
All right. Well, if we stay on the topic of the AfD, because these days when we talk about German politics, it's always obsessing about the AfD for good reason. So this also is a question that we have gotten from the audience. So in both Baden-Württemberg and in Rheinland-Pfalz, the AfD is third. And if you look at the polls, you see that they seem to be about 20% or in like the 18 to 20% range. And they've been there for a while. So I guess, I mean, two observations on that. First of all, the AfD is twice as strong in the eastern states than in the western states. So we see that kind of pattern persisting. But this also would represent about a doubling of the AfD's vote compared to the 2021 elections. And so the question is, where is the AfD getting this support from? At which other parties' expenses?
I would like to answer it from a slightly different angle, because both of these states are interesting with respect to right-wing voting. Let's put it that way. The state of Baden-Württemberg, I mean, those of us who've experienced maybe the 90s might remember that at that time, the German version of the Republikaner, the Republicans, which at the time was considered, well, and for good reasons, don't get me wrong, there as a right-wing, radical right at least party, they did very well in the state of Baden-Württemberg. If you go back even further, historically, you always had parts of the state of Baden-Württemberg where right-wing parties did very, very well. And these are still, and that's in a way amazing that you see these transitions over centuries, including times where there was no right-wing party. But how this continuity there, it's the region of Heilbronn, for example, Pforzheim, so kind of this north of Stuttgart area, where they traditionally would do very well, and that is again the case. They're very conservative there. Some would maybe say they're not very open-minded, but that's an interesting continuity there. Rhineland-Palatinate, if you followed the German federal election closely, one of the constituencies where the AfD did extremely well in the federal election was, the soccer fans, of course, know the name Kaiserslautern. So actually not actually a city, not like a small rural town, but a city in an area that used to do much better economically than they have been doing for quite a while. So all the industries that would have been there have been shut down or gone away. Similar patterns in the Ruhr area, if you look at North Rhine-Westphalia. So it's not necessarily countryside or what we see there, but it's rather not like university large scales, but cities that have economically experienced very tough times. The northern part of Hesse, where we in the state election saw similar patterns. These are regions where the AfD is able to pick up votes from the Social Democrats. They used to be traditionally strong there, but also in terms of mobilizing voters. That's why turnout is quite crucial also for all of these state elections. Traditionally, we would say turnout is good for the Social Democrats or left parties. That's actually no longer necessarily the case. The picture has become slightly more diversified there. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it there for the moment.
All right. So one more question on the AfD, if I may. Well, I mean, it seems that they're always generating scandals, right? But usually scandals in the eyes of others. But now they seem to be in the midst of a scandal that is of their own making and might affect their voters. And this is the nepotism scandal with relatives of AFD members of parliament being given quite high salaries from what I've read, working for other MPs, either at the state or at the federal level. I know that this has been a particular issue, again, in Saxony-Anhalt, with the lead candidate there for the AFD, this Ulrich Sigmund, being caught up in that. And so the question is, do you think that this scandal is going to actually affect the level of support that they have either in these states, but also nationally?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I guess we had, in a way, similar. They weren't exactly the same, but we had very intense debates about leading candidates of the AFD in the context of the European election, possibly spying for foreign countries there. Didn't really affect them after all. Now that was, you could say, still more policy oriented in a way, although it's hard to say it that way. This clearly, as you mentioned, I mean, this is nepotism, right? So this is really something they would be furious about if it happened in other parties, because it would exactly be that narrative that the other parties just exploit the state in their very own personal interest. Um, I guess the key question is, does this sort of reporting, and that's not a given these days, does that get through to potential voters? I mean, of course, there's a lot of reporting on this, but it's on these networks, the newspapers, that these people, or that a lot of people no longer receive, read, hear, watch, right? So it's that's really key these days. And we simply, I mean, this is trivia almost, but we cannot take for granted that each and everyone hears about these things, that this is accepted as true factual reporting. So um, it- I wouldn't be too optimistic there, actually. Although, what I would like to stress, slightly apart from the specifics, we have, I mean, all this, I mentioned volatility, etc. That's also true for the AFD. The AFD numbers have gone up and down. In recent years, they've gone rather up than down because the circumstances were rather beneficial for them. But if you think of like the 2017 or at the 21 election, actually, compared to the 25 election, that was, I mean, there were massive shifts, and they do happen in both directions, and we shouldn't forget that.
All right, so let's move on. Well, I can't resist one observation. I mean, the populism literature also shows that often supporters of populist parties have no problem whatsoever with
Yeah.
corruption on their side, but are, mortified and scandalized by anything similar that might happen elsewhere. So that might just be another reinforcing data point for this finding from the kind of literature. But let's move and talk about the youth vote again. I thought that graphic that you showed over the longue durée and how the preferences of the 18 to 24 age group have shifted so much. But I mean, I think a lot of people are still in shock comparing the 2021 Bundestag election to the 2025 Bundestag election, because back in 2021, young women really liked the Greens and young men liked the FDP, the Liberal Party. But then in 2025, that went totally away, and young men like the AFD and young women like the left party. So I guess a few more thoughts on what's causing this volatility. And specifically, here's a question from the audience. What are the issues that are animating and motivating younger voters to make such very different choices from one electoral cycle to the next?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because I rushed through this, and I know it's a lot of material that one maybe might have to digest for a second. So that is, first of all, very remarkable that I mean, the 21 election was remarkable with respect to the youth vote. This is 18 to 24-year-olds, because for the very first time ever, it was neither social nor Christian Democrats that came in first place among the young, but it was, as you said at the time, the liberals among men, the Greens among young female voters that came in first place. But that was yet again, or became more extreme in the 25 election. If you add the 24 European election, you actually see that at that election, it was more or less only the AfD that was very strong among young voters. Although one has to be slightly careful there, they do come in as the first place party, but still, all the young people vote all over the place. So a high vote share among the young might be, except for the left among women in 25, but in general might be 25 or even less than that, which is not like a dominant position. So the key when we think of young people is actually that they're willing to cast their vote really all over the political spectrum. Furthermore, what's interesting though, if you compare the 24 European with the 25 federal election, is that you really see, and we've published a few youth study paper actually on that, that you really see a perfect match between what they report they had seen on social media compared to their voting behavior. So that volatility, you can also, for the 25 election, you can see that the especially young women, but general young people voted for the left was something that really started after those things that happened in the Bundestag, the Christian Democrats voting with the AfD there for the very first time. That triggered the momentum for the left party and young people voting for the left. So there's nothing stable there in a way. It's really very volatile in many directions. But again, we do see that it's key to get through with political messages. And that's not a given. We see when we ask people which parties do you see on social media, that they hardly report anything about having heard from Greens, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, even though they spend a lot of money on these channels, but apparently they don't get through. Um, Issue-wise, maybe I can link it back to Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Palatinate, because the agenda in both states is actually very different. We see that the people in Baden-Württemberg, I mean, this is kind of the economic powerhouse of Germany with a lot of car industry there or manufacturing there. They are very worried about the future of their economic structure, their economic base there. So the state election, Baden-Württemberg, is very much dominated by a focus on the economy, not so much immigration, actually. That's just coming in second, third place, but really economy. For Rhineland-Palatinate, rather typical picture that we see for state elections, it's all about education. That's one of the few things where state governments have a lot of opportunities to shape that policy field at the state level. That's not true for too many policy fields, but it is in the case of education, and that dominates the picture there with respect to the issue agenda, and that's specifically true for young people. In general, though, final thought on young people and issues. Um, we shouldn't speak of a generation of young people, because also with respect to issue positions, we see huge differences between female, male voters, rural versus urban voters, highly educated versus people that have a low level of formal education. So to speak of the issue preferences of the youth is actually not appropriate. It's an extremely heterogeneous generation, and that's actually most characteristic for them.
Well, just to follow up on issues for a second, because this is something that has gotten some reporting. As I'm sure everybody participating knows, Germany is spending a lot more on defense and is envisioning all sorts of different reforms, also to the Wehrpflicht, the duty to serve in the armed forces. And they haven't gone back to the way things were, I think, pre-2011, where it was just a duty for young men to do this or to do the alternative civil service. They haven't gone back to that, but it's certainly something being spoken about. That would obviously be an issue of great concern to young people. But has that, or has, there's been a lot of talk about pension reform and whatnot. Are issues like that something that they care about?
Um, there's some polling out there with respect to this to the military service, and we see significant age differences there. That the older people are, the more they are in support of compulsory military service. There, the young are way more reluctant in that respect. But I guess the political debate is, I mean, the idea that this might be based on some random selection that kind of blew up ultimately. So I don't really see where the political debate is going, but we see some, and I mean, we know this in a way, right? Being personally affected by a policy does shape the perspective there, and that's clearly a position there. Um, Actually, the discussions about taxes, pensions, uh, I mean, that was one of the huge debates within that new grand coalition that we have, the formula about pensions, the Rentenformel, where they really had, I mean, a very hard time. I mean, they were, I would say, almost on the verge of breaking up as a coalition. Really had a hard time to find a compromise. But it was so complicated that it's not actually something that is easily taken to campaign context and affects that in significant ways. In general, kind of the confidence in the pension system has gone down over time, but not as far as I'm aware of, not necessarily in very age specific ways, I would say. I think it's just I mean, we used to have almost consensus when it came to the welfare state in Germany across all groups. That has eroded, but not not in terms of age, I would say. I haven't seen too much in that respect.
All right. Well, we're rapidly running out of time. And
Too bad,
I
yeah.
really want to put one more question to you because you brought it up, and that has to do with social media and how, especially, I'm thinking back to the federal elections last year, that it was really the AfD and the left party that seemed to break through on social media. And I think, as you put it, this is despite the substantial investments that the other parties, the centrist parties, kind of put into that. Why do you think that the centrist parties have not been able to break through or have not been able to master the art of social media?
Yeah, I think the way you put it is to the point. They've not mastered the art of. I mean, I don't know what people here use in terms of social media, but if you like scroll through TikTok, Insta Reels, I mean, after milliseconds, you realize, oh, this is a political ad from a traditional party, because they're different. They're just not maybe to the point as others are. Still, that's maybe only part of the answer, because there's other research out there that has basically looked at the algorithm and its role. And they have created this as work done by colleagues in Potsdam together with, I think, the Bertelsmann Foundation. So they've basically set up these fake accounts and tried to act as politically neutral as possible. But even those accounts ultimately ended up receiving a lot of content from AfD and left. So I mean, it is methodologically extremely difficult to disentangle party efforts, self-selection, the role the algorithm plays, but I found that very convincing, that there's quite a strong role for the algorithms there. And I mean, there's always massive debate about public broadcasting in Germany. I think thinking of ways to regulate other media, which has been done I mean, let's don't get me wrong there, right? I mean, private broadcasting is regulated to some extent in Germany. You can't do whatever you want with respect to press. Doesn't mean you censor that, but there's still limits. There are ideas of balancing, but I don't see really efforts to apply these traditional ideas to these modern networks. Easy for me to say on a nice Thursday day, but still, I think that's, in a way, it's critical infrastructure that would deserve way more attention.
All right. Well, we have actually come to the end of our time together. Do you have any parting thoughts? Do you want to take a stab at a prediction for this Sunday's election in Baden-Württemberg? Will the Greens pull it off?
Usually, there is a momentum there that was clearly visible last week, and usually that goes all the way up until election day. So I wouldn't be surprised if we really saw a strong green result on Sunday. There was a lot of debate about that social media video of the leading CDU candidate that was very caught a lot or made a lot of headline news. That has eroded, so that might help the Christian Democrats. Again, my expectation would be that the Greens will fare well and very likely come in first place. But again, as I said before, I don't really know it, and I think that's actually the decent answer. I to point that out, that so much can happen until the very end. 10-15% of voters actually make up their mind on election day. So I guess ultimately we have to wait, and in soccer you would say entscheidend ist auf dem Platz. Ultimately decisive is what happens on the field, and that's Sunday.
All right, Torsten, thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this webinar today. I thought it was just wonderful and very, very, very informative. And thanks also to all of the participants who listened. This has been recorded and will be posted to the American German Institute's website. So those who couldn't participate in real time will be able to benefit from this great analysis. Anyway, thanks again, Torsten.
Thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Bye.